I never realized how much I had given until the day I was no longer needed. The thought didn't arrive like a thunderclap, but like the slow, creeping chill of a draft from a window I'd never noticed was open. For 68 years, my life had been a tapestry woven with the threads of other people's needs. I was the sturdy, unseen warp holding everyone else's vibrant colors together. And then, one ordinary Tuesday, I felt a thread snap. The clock on the living room mantelpiece, a wedding gift from my late mother-in-law, ticked with a quiet, judgmental rhythm. Each talk was a second of my life spent, each tick a second I wouldn't get back. Its sound was the metronome to my days of silent service. I sat in my armchair, the one with the permanent impression of my body molded into its faded floral cushions. A crocheted throw, my own handiwork from a decade ago, was draped over the back, its soft yarn a testament to countless evenings spent waiting for my husband, John, to come home from work, or for the sound of my children's key in the lock. My glasses were perched on the end of my nose, and an old recipe book lay open on my lap. I wasn't reading it, I had memorized its pages long ago. The splatters of batter and grease on the page for Sunday pot roast were like a road map of my family's history, a history I had cooked and cleaned and carried into existence. The camera of my memory panned across the photos on the wall, school pictures, weddings, awkward teenage phases, grandchildren smeared with birthday cake. Faded memories of what I had convinced myself were happier days. In every single one, I was there, slightly to the side, my smile a little tired, my arms usually around a child or a grandchild, my presence a given, like the wallpaper. The front door burst open, shattering the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock. It was my daughter, Beth, a whirlwind of professional ambition and maternal chaos. She was talking into her phone, her voice a sharp, efficient staccato that belonged in a boardroom, not my quiet living room. "No, Mark, the projections are too conservative. We need to be aggressive. Push it to Q4, she said, her briefcase slung over one shoulder and her purse over the other. Her gaze swept the room but didn't land on me. It was a functional scan, checking for obstacles, not for her mother. My own eyes flickered up from the recipe book, a silent, hopeful plea for a glance, a small smile, a moment of connection that would affirm my existence in this space I so carefully maintained for them all. The plea went unanswered. She was absorbed, her world contained within the small, glowing rectangle pressed to her ear. She finally ended the call with an abrupt, "Gotta go," and stuffed the phone into her purse. She turned, her eyes finally finding me, but there was no warmth in them, only a checklist. "Mom, the caterer for Jack's party cancelled. I have a client dinner tonight I absolutely cannot miss. Can you handle it? Just something simple. Sandwiches, a salad. You know." It wasn't a question, it was a delegation. Before I could even form a response, she added, "Oh, and I need to run. I have to leave in 10. Can you grab my gym bag from the garage? I think I left it in the dryer." She held up a single car key, dangling it from her finger as if it were a magic wand that could conjure my compliance. Then, she disappeared into the kitchen, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air like an accusation. I rose from the chair. My joints protested, a symphony of quiet clicks and groans that had become the background music of my life. My body, stiff from years of bending, lifting, and serving, moved with the slow, deliberate pace of age. I walked toward the door that led to the garage, each step feeling heavier than the last. I had always been the one who asked for nothing. My world had been a tiny, well-ordered planet that revolved around the gravitational pull of their needs, their wants, their emergencies. The unspoken price of being always there was, I was beginning to realize, the assumption that I had nowhere else to be. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. From the kitchen, I could hear the clatter of the coffee maker. John was at the table, I knew, hidden behind the rustling pages of the morning paper. He'd been retired for 3 years, and his presence in the house during the day was a solid, silent, and entirely self-contained fact. He managed his own world of news, naps, and televised sports with a singular focus that rarely intersected with mine, unless he needed a fresh cup of coffee or couldn't find the remote control. As I opened the door to the garage, the humid scent of freshly dried laundry, my laundry, filled the air. I saw Beth's gym bag sitting neatly on top of the dryer, exactly where I had folded its contents and placed it that morning. I picked it up. It was light. My contributions were always light, easily carried, easily forgotten. I turned back toward the kitchen, the bag in my hand. Through the doorway, I could see John. He glanced up from his paper as I entered, his eyes registering my presence for a fleeting second before returning to the stock market report. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the errand I'd just run for his daughter, no recognition of the weight in my shoulders, a weight far heavier than any gym bag. It was a look that passed straight through me as if I were a ghost in my own home. And in that moment, something inside me didn't just snap. It disintegrated. It turned to dust and blew away on the draft from that window I hadn't known was open. The feeling was so profound, so absolute, it stole my breath. I was invisible. A household appliance, expected to function silently and efficiently until the day it breaks down and needs to be replaced. All the years, all the sacrifices, all the love I had poured into this family, had resulted in this, a polite, functional erasure. I stood there, rooted to the linoleum floor, the gym bag clutched in my hand. Beth breezed back in, grabbing the bag from my fingers with a distracted, "Thanks, Mom, you're a lifesaver," and rushed out the door, leaving behind only the echo of her hurry. John turned a page of his newspaper. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked, and I stood utterly, completely still, realizing with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that I had been a lifesaver for so long, I had completely forgotten how to save myself. That was the moment I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something had to change. Not them. Me. The silent foundation of their world was about to develop a tremor, and I had no idea if any of us would be left standing when the shaking stopped. The day after the incident with the gym bag, a new kind of silence settled in the house. It wasn't the comfortable, lived-in quiet I was used to. It was a humming, tense silence, audible only to me. It was the sound of a lifetime of assumptions being called into question in the courtroom of my own mind. As I went about my morning routine, making the coffee, unloading the dishwasher, wiping counters that were already clean, I began to see my world through a new, painfully clear lens. Every object, every task, seemed to testify to the unseen cost of my devotion. The worn spot on the carpet in front of the sink wasn't just a sign of wear, it was a map of the thousands of hours I had stood there, washing dishes for a family that rarely said thank you. The perfectly aligned spices in the rack weren't just organized, they were a monument to my thankless anticipation of everyone else's tastes. I started to actively look for the evidence, to gather it like a prosecutor building a case. And it was everywhere. That afternoon, I went to the pantry to plan for dinner and discovered the box of spaghetti I'd intended to use was gone. The half-full bag of gourmet coffee beans John liked was empty, replaced by a crumpled, discarded bag in the trash. I remembered Beth mentioning she was having friends over last week. She must have come by while I was out at my garden club meeting, helping herself to whatever she needed, a silent raid on a supply depot she considered eternally stocked. There was no note, no text message, no thought to replace what she'd taken. It was a small thing, a $5 box of pasta and some coffee, but it landed in my heart like a stone. It wasn't about the money. It was about the casual presumption, the complete lack of consideration for the person who made sure those things were there in the first place. I was not a person with my own plans or needs, I was simply the keeper of the pantry. The internal conflict began to rage. One part of me, the deeply ingrained mother and wife, whispered excuses. She's busy. She has a high-pressure job. She didn't mean anything by it. But another voice, a newer, angrier one, shot back. Busy is not an excuse for disrespect. She is a grown woman. She knows better. This new voice was terrifying. It was laced with a resentment I had spent my entire adult life suppressing. For decades, I had prided myself on being easygoing, on not making a fuss. I had watched other women my age complain about their husbands or their ungrateful children and felt a quiet sense of superiority. My family, I told myself, was different. John was a good provider. Beth and my son, Michael, were successful and independent. What I failed to see was that their independence had been built on the bedrock of my constant, unwavering dependence. They were free because I was tethered. A few days later, the family gathered for an impromptu Sunday dinner. Michael, his wife Sarah, and their 2 children came over. I spent the entire day cooking. A pot roast, the one from the grease-splattered page, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and a homemade apple pie. The house filled with the warm, comforting smells of home. Or at least, what I thought of as home. As they all sat around the table, the conversation swirled around me. Michael's promotion. Sarah's new volunteer committee. The grandchildren's soccer triumphs. John recounted a golf game with his buddies. I moved back and forth from the kitchen, refilling glasses, bringing out more bread, clearing plates. I was a waitress in a restaurant where I was also the chef, the dishwasher, and the owner, and from which I would never receive a paycheck or even a decent tip. At one point, my granddaughter, little Emily, looked at me and said, "Grandma, this pie is the best." Her sweet, innocent voice was a bomb. But then Sarah chimed in, not to me, but to the table at large. "My mom used to make a pie just like this. It's such a classic, old-fashioned recipe, isn't it?" And just like that, my specific, laborious effort was rendered generic, an old-fashioned recipe, as if the pie had simply materialized out of a collective memory of grandmother's past. My contribution was acknowledged only as a type, not as a personal act of love and effort from the woman standing right there with flour still faintly dusting her apron. No one else seemed to notice the slight. John just grunted in agreement and asked for another slice. Michael was already on his phone, checking work emails. After they had all left, leaving a mountain of dishes in their wake, I stood in the silent dining room. The table was a disaster zone of crumpled napkins, stained plates, and half-empty glasses. The leftover pie sat on the counter, a single, mangled piece remaining. I had asked John if he could help me clear the table. He had looked up from the television, a pained expression on his face as if I'd asked him to perform surgery. "I'm right in the middle of this game, Gene. It's the final quarter," he'd said, his eyes already glued back to the screen. I started clearing the plates, my hands moving with practiced efficiency. But my mind was far away. It had traveled back 30 years, to a small, cramped apartment and a younger version of myself. I was sitting at a rickety kitchen table, sketching in a charcoal pad. I had been good, once. I'd even won a small scholarship to an art program, a path I'd abandoned when I found out I was pregnant with Beth. John had come home that night, exhausted from his job at the plant. He had looked at my drawing, a portrait of a sleeping cat, and smiled. "That's nice, honey," he'd said. "But you know, that real estate license course starts next week. You could really help bring in some extra money." I had put the charcoal down. I had enrolled in the course. I never picked up the charcoal again. I sold 3 houses, hated every minute of it, and then Michael was born, and I settled into my permanent role as a homemaker. John had meant well, I'm sure. It was a practical suggestion. But standing there, in my silent, messy dining room, I finally understood the unseen cost of that decision. It wasn't just the loss of a hobby. I had traded my own canvas for the canvas of their lives, and they had painted their futures all over it, leaving no room for me. The cost had been my own portrait, a picture of who I might have been. And the most painful part was the realization that no one else had ever even noticed it was missing. The silence in the room was no longer just tense, it was mournful. It was the sound of a ghost, the ghost of the woman I had given up, weeping for all the years she had been invisible. And I knew I couldn't bear her sorrow any longer. The growing turmoil inside me began to feel like a pot of water set to boil, the lid rattling with a pressure that could no longer be contained. The constant internal monologue, The endless tallying of slights was exhausting. I felt myself fraying at the edges, my usual patience worn down to a transparent thread. My smiles felt brittle, my of course dears sounded hollow even to my own ears. I knew that if I didn't find a release valve, I would explode, and the resulting mess would be far more damaging than a forgotten box of spaghetti. So, for the first time in 40 years of marriage, I decided to take a day off. It wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture. I didn't pack a bag and run away. I simply woke up on a Wednesday morning and decided that for the next 12 hours, I would not be at anyone's service. I didn't announce it. An announcement would have invited negotiation, protests, or, worse, John's bewildered and slightly wounded look that always made me feel instantly guilty. Instead, I just stopped. I made my coffee and took it not to my usual armchair, but out to the back porch. I left the newspaper on the front step where the delivery boy had thrown it. John could get it himself. The thought was so radical it felt like a small, thrilling crime. I sat on the old wooden swing, cradling the warm mug in my hands, and watched the sun climb over the neighbor's roof. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the roses I had so carefully cultivated along the fence line. I had planted those roses, fed them, pruned them, and protected them from aphids, yet I rarely took the time to simply enjoy their beauty. I was always on my way to do something else. But not today. Today, I watched a fat bumblebee lumber from one bloom to another. I noticed the intricate, dewy pattern of a spider's web spun between two leaves. I felt the warmth of the sun on my face, a simple, physical pleasure I realized I hadn't consciously registered in years. It was a feeling untethered to any expectation. Later, I wandered back inside. The house was quiet. John was still asleep. I walked past the laundry basket, overflowing with his shirts and socks, and felt a familiar tug of duty. "Just one load," the old voice whispered. "It'll only take a minute." I paused, my hand hovering over a stray sock. Then, with a resolve that surprised me, I turned and walked away. I went into the spare bedroom, the one that had been Michael's and was now a repository for old furniture and forgotten hobbies. In the back of the closet, under a pile of old blankets, was a wooden box. My art supplies. I opened it. The smell of graphite and old paper filled the air. My charcoal sticks were still there, nestled in their compartments. My sketchpads were yellowed at the edges but otherwise pristine. I ran my fingers over the smooth, black charcoal, a jolt of something electric, something long dormant, shooting up my arm. I took the pad and a stick of charcoal and went back to the porch. I started to draw one of the roses. My hand was clumsy at first, the lines uncertain. The woman who knew how to create a perfect flaky pie crust had forgotten how to create a simple, curved line. But I kept at it. I lost myself in the challenge of capturing the way the light hit the petals, the deep shadow in the flower's heart. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was creating something for no one but myself. There was no practical purpose to this drawing. It would not feed anyone. It would not clean anything. Its only reason for being was my own desire to create it. It was a revelation. But as the day wore on, the guilt began to creep in, a slow, seeping tide. Around noon, I heard John moving around upstairs. I heard the shower run. I heard him come downstairs and open the refrigerator. "Jean?" he called out. "Is there any coffee made?" My heart leaped into my throat. The urge to jump up, to apologize for the empty pot, to scurry into the kitchen and fix my oversight was overwhelming. It was a physical reflex, honed by 4 decades of practice. I held my breath, clutching the charcoal so tightly it threatened to snap. I didn't answer. I sat perfectly still on the porch swing, hidden from the kitchen window's view. "Jean?" he called again, his voice a little louder, tinged with confusion. I heard the refrigerator door close. A cupboard opened and slammed shut. A frustrated sigh. Then, silence. I imagined him standing there, bewildered, in a kitchen that had never, not once in 40 years, failed to provide him with hot coffee on demand. A part of me felt a terrible pang of sorrow for his confusion. I had made his world so seamless, so effortless, that the slightest disruption was a genuine shock to his system. I had built this comfortable cage for him, and now I was rattling the bars, and it was frightening us both. The phone rang later that afternoon. I saw Beth's name flash on the screen. I knew what it would be. A last-minute request to pick up one of the kids from school, a reminder about a bill she'd forgotten to pay, a question about a recipe. My thumb hovered over the green answer button. My entire being screamed at me to answer it. A good mother is always available. A good mother answers the phone. But the woman sitting on the porch, the one with charcoal smudged on her fingers and a half-finished drawing of a rose on her lap, hesitated. She was learning to let go, even if it felt like stepping off a cliff. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, it went to voicemail. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a boundary being drawn, a faint, shaky line in the sand. I didn't know if I had the strength to defend it, but I had drawn it. And as I looked down at the charcoal rose taking shape on the page, a flower that was mine alone, I felt a tiny, fragile bud of hope begin to bloom in the desolate landscape of my heart. The unraveling had begun, and I was both terrified and thrilled to see what would be left when everything came undone. The family gathering was for John's 70th birthday, a milestone that, according to Beth, required a proper celebration. She had organized it, which meant she had booked a private room at a nice local restaurant and then emailed me a long list of small things she needed me to handle: the cake, the party favors, coordinating with out-of-town relatives, and, of course, making sure John wore the new shirt she'd sent over. For 2 weeks, I was a flurry of activity, an unpaid event planner working for a demanding client. The old me would have done it with silent, efficient pride, finding satisfaction in a perfectly executed party. The new me, the one who had spent a secret afternoon drawing roses, did it with a growing sense of cold, hard clarity. Each phone call I made, each errand I ran, was another piece of evidence for the case I was building in my mind. The night of the party, the restaurant was buzzing. The private room was filled with family and a few of John's old friends. Everyone was laughing, drinking wine, and sharing stories about John. I moved through the room with a practiced social grace, smiling, making sure everyone was comfortable, playing the role of the perfect hostess. But inside, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a play about my own life. I watched Beth command the room, her voice confident and loud, as she told a funny story about her father teaching her to drive. I watched Michael show pictures of his kids on his phone to his uncle. I watched John, at the head of the table, basking in the attention, accepting the toasts and backslaps with a pleased, benevolent air. The moment that tipped the scale wasn't dramatic. It was small, almost unnoticeable to anyone else. The cake, a beautiful, multi-layered confection I had ordered from the best bakery in town and picked up that morning, was brought out. Everyone sang happy birthday. John blew out the candles to a round of applause. As the waiter began to cut the cake, Beth leaned over to me, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Mom, did you remember to ask for the gluten-free frosting? You know Sarah can't have gluten." I froze. I had forgotten. In the whirlwind of her other 20 demands, the detail about the frosting for my daughter-in-law, a detail Beth herself had only mentioned in passing a week ago, had slipped my mind. A hot flush of shame and failure washed over me, the familiar sting of not being perfect, of letting someone down. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry." It completely slipped my mind, I started to say, but Beth didn't let me finish. She rolled her eyes with theatrical exasperation. "Honestly, Mom. It was the one thing I asked you to make sure of." She turned to Sarah, who was sitting across the table. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I told Mom, but you know how it is." She patted my hand in a gesture that was meant to look like affection but felt like a condescending dismissal. "It's okay, Mom. Don't worry about it." But it wasn't okay. The public nature of the rebuke, The casual way she threw me under the bus to absolve herself of any responsibility, the implication that I was becoming forgetful and unreliable, it was all there in that one little exchange. I looked around the table. No one seemed to have noticed. Sarah gave up a light, "Oh, it's no problem at all." John was already digging into his slice of cake. Michael was looking at his watch. My small, public humiliation was a non-event. It was just Mom, being Mom, slightly flawed but ultimately insignificant. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I smiled. I nodded. I answered questions. But inside, the boiling pot was finally overflowing. The pressure had become unbearable. All the gym bags, the empty pantries, the unwashed dishes, the forgotten charcoal sketches, and now, the gluten-free frosting, it all coalesced into a single, massive weight of indignation. This wasn't just about chores or neglect anymore. It was about the slow, systematic erosion of my identity. It was about the unspoken emotional debt that had been compounding for 40 years, a debt they had incurred and I had paid, over and over again. When the party was winding down and people were starting to leave, Beth came over to me, her coat on, her purse slung over her shoulder. "That went well, I think," she said, a self-satisfied smile on her face. He seemed happy. "Thanks for your help, Mom." She leaned in to give me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. I didn't lean in. I stood my ground, and she stopped, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. I looked directly at her, not with anger, but with a profound, weary sadness that had finally found its voice. My voice was quiet, steady, and clear. It cut through the clatter of the restaurant staff clearing tables. "Beth," I said, holding her gaze. "The cake, the calls, the shirt. I did all of it. I've always done all of it. I have always been there for you. For every crisis, for every party, for every sick child, for every single thing you've ever needed." I paused, letting the weight of those words hang in the air between us. Her smile faltered. She looked uncomfortable, glancing around to see if anyone was listening. "But when was the last time you were there for me?" The question fell into the space between us, simple, direct, and utterly devastating in its truth. It wasn't an accusation, it was a genuine inquiry, one I had never dared to ask and she had never thought to consider. I watched the color drain from her face. The easy confidence she wore like a shield suddenly seemed to dissolve, replaced by a raw, startled vulnerability. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence that followed was more profound than any argument. It was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. And in that silence, for the very first time, I felt the solid ground of my own self-respect beneath my feet. I had spoken my truth, and I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that nothing would ever be the same again. The car ride home from the restaurant was a study in profound silence. John drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He hadn't been close enough to hear my exchange with Beth, but he could sense the atmospheric shift. The air in our small sedan was thick with unspoken words, with the fallout of a bomb only I had heard detonate. He cleared his throat a couple of times, as if preparing to speak, but he never did. He didn't know what had happened, and the truth was, he didn't know how to ask. Our entire marriage had been built on the placid surface of things, and he was a man who was terrified of deep water. When we got home, he went straight to the living room and turned on the television, seeking refuge in the familiar noise. I walked through the quiet house, my heels clicking on the hardwood floors. I felt strangely calm, emptied out. The confrontation hadn't brought the cathartic release I might have expected. Instead, it left a vacuum, a hollow space where 40 years of repressed feelings used to be. The silence from Beth was absolute. No text message. No phone call. The next day was a Saturday, and the phone remained quiet. It was a loud, deliberate silence, the kind that is a response in itself. She was angry. Or hurt. Or both. I found myself wandering into the spare room again, drawn to the box of art supplies like a pilgrim to a shrine. But I couldn't bring myself to draw. My mind was a tangled knot of guilt, fear, and a strange, terrifying exhilaration. Had I gone too far? Had I irreparably damaged my relationship with my daughter over a plate of cake and a dismissive comment? The good mother in me screamed yes. She shrieked that I was being selfish, dramatic, and ungrateful. She reminded me that Beth was a busy, important woman and that I should be proud of her, not resentful. But the new voice, the one that had spoken up in the restaurant, was quieter but more persistent. It told me that my feelings were valid. It told me that asking for consideration was not a crime. It told me that my relationship with my daughter, if it was real, had to be strong enough to withstand the truth. The battle between these two voices was relentless, leaving me exhausted and emotionally raw. By Sunday evening, I knew I couldn't navigate this alone. The tangled knot in my mind was too complex for me to unpick by myself. I needed a guide. On Monday morning, with a tremor in my hands, I opened my laptop and typed therapists near me into the search bar. The results felt overwhelming. Each face smiling out from the screen seemed to promise a solution, a path forward. I felt a surge of shame. What was I doing? People like me didn't go to therapy. We coped. We carried on. We confided in a close friend over a cup of tea, if we confided at all. Therapy was for people with real problems, not for a lonely old woman who is upset because her children didn't appreciate her enough. But as I was about to close the laptop, I saw a listing for a Dr. R.S. Thorne. Her profile picture showed a woman about my own age, with kind eyes and a calm expression. Her specialty was listed as life transitions, family dynamics, and rediscovering personal identity. It was as if the words had been written specifically for me. I read her bio. She talked about helping clients find their voice and set healthy boundaries. The phrase healthy boundaries resonated deep within me. It was the perfect description of the shaky line I had tried to draw in the sand. Taking a deep breath, I picked up the phone. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dialed the number. Voicemail. I almost hung up, but something made me stay on the line. After the beep, I spoke, my voice barely a whisper. Hello, my name is Jean Miller. I would like to make an appointment. I left my number and hung up, my hands shaking. The act of making that call felt more momentous than the confrontation with Beth. It was a concrete step, a commitment not to them, but to myself. It was an admission that I was broken and a declaration that I was willing to do the work to heal. A few hours later, a number I didn't recognize lit up my phone screen. It was Dr. Thorne's office. A kind receptionist scheduled an appointment for me for the following week. After I hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at my rose garden. The drawing I had started was still on the porch swing, slightly damp from the morning dew. I had taken a step into a new, unknown territory. The path ahead was terrifying, shrouded in fog, but for the first time, it felt like my own. The silence from Beth continued, a heavy blanket over our family. But now, I had a glimmer of light, a promise of a guide who might help me find my way through the darkness. The journey within had officially begun, and my first appointment felt like a distant, hopeful shore I was slowly, painstakingly swimming toward. The therapist's office was in a renovated old house on a quiet, tree-lined street. It didn't feel clinical or intimidating. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and shelves filled with books, not magazines. It smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. I sat, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my stomach aflutter with a nervous energy I hadn't felt since my first day of high school. I was Jean Miller, 68 years old, and I was about to tell a complete stranger that my life felt like a failure. Dr. R.S. Thorne was exactly as her picture had suggested. She was a tall, elegant woman with silver hair cut in a stylish bob and eyes that were both intelligent and deeply compassionate. She didn't greet me with a flood of false warmth, but with a quiet, respectful nod. "Jean," she said, her voice calm and even. "Thank you for coming. Please, come in." Her office was like the waiting room, cozy and safe. We sat in two comfortable armchairs facing each other, a small table between us. For the first few minutes, I struggled to speak. The words were lodged in my throat, A lifetime of keeping quiet acting as a formidable dam. Dr. Thorne simply waited. She didn't push or prod. She just held the space, her patient silence giving me permission to find my own starting point. Finally, I began, the story tumbling out in a disorganized rush. The gym bag. The gluten-free frosting. The forgotten charcoal sketches. I told her about John and his newspaper, about Beth's casual demands, about the feeling of being invisible. As I spoke, I felt a hot flush of shame, hearing my complaints out loud. They sounded so petty, so trivial. "I know it sounds silly," I said, my voice cracking. "These are such small things. My daughter is a good person. My husband is a good man. I have a comfortable life. I should be grateful." "Gratitude and disappointment can coexist, Jean," Dr. Thorne said gently. "Your feelings are not silly. They are the result of a pattern that has been in place for a very long time. You're describing what we call emotional labor, the unseen, unacknowledged work you do to keep everyone around you comfortable and happy. You've been the emotional manager of your family for decades. That is a very real, and very exhausting, job." Hearing her put a name to it, emotional labor, was a revelation. It validated everything I was feeling. I wasn't just being sensitive or dramatic. I was experiencing a recognized phenomenon. In that first session, we didn't solve anything. We just talked. Or rather, I talked, and she listened with an attentiveness that was a gift in itself. She asked questions that made me think in new ways. "When you were a young woman, before you were a wife and mother, what did you dream of becoming?" she asked. The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it brought tears to my eyes. I told her about my art scholarship, a dream I hadn't spoken of in almost 50 years. I left that first session feeling lighter than I had in ages. Nothing had changed in my external world. Beth still wasn't speaking to me, John was still glued to the TV, but something inside me had shifted. I had been seen. I had been heard. During my second session, Dr. Thorne suggested an exercise. She wanted me to reconnect with someone from my past, someone who knew me before I was John's wife or Beth and Michael's mom. The idea was terrifying. Who would I even call? Most of my old friends had scattered, or we drifted apart, our lives taking different paths. But one name came to mind, Carol. We had been inseparable in high school, two giggling girls with shared dreams of traveling the world. I found her on social media, living just 2 towns over. It took me a week to build up the courage to send her a message. To my astonishment, she replied within the hour. "Jean Miller. I can't believe it. Of course I remember you. Let's get coffee." We met at a small cafe downtown. Seeing her was a shock. The vibrant, dark-haired girl I remembered was now a woman with laugh lines and stylishly gray-streaked hair, but her eyes were the same, sparkling with mischief. The initial awkwardness melted away in minutes. We didn't talk about our husbands or our children at first. We talked about us. We laughed about the time we tried to dye our hair blonde with lemon juice and ended up with orange streaks. We reminisced about our favorite English teacher, Mrs. Gable. Carol had never married. She'd had a long career as a landscape architect and had traveled all over the world, just as we'd planned. She showed me pictures on her phone of her in front of the pyramids in Egypt, on a hiking trail in Peru, in a bustling market in Morocco. I felt a pang of something, not envy, exactly, but a deep, mournful sense of a path not taken. "I ended up becoming a professional grandma," I said with a weak, self-deprecating laugh. Carol didn't laugh with me. She looked at me, her expression serious. "There is nothing wrong with that, Jean. But is it what makes you happy?" The directness of her question, so much like Dr. Thorne's, cut through my defenses. I found myself telling her everything. Not the petty complaints, but the deep, aching loneliness of it all. She listened, nodding, her gaze never wavering. She didn't offer solutions or platitudes. She just listened, a friend listening to a friend. "You know," she said after I finished, "I'm taking a pottery class on Thursday nights at the community center. It's messy and fun, and most of us are terrible at it. You should come with me." An invitation. A door opening into a world that was entirely separate from my family, from my home, from the life I had known. It was an invitation to be just Jean. Not Mom, not Grandma, not John's wife. Just Jean. It was thrilling. It was terrifying. I don't know, I stammered. John expects me home on Thursdays. Carol smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. John is a grown man, Jean. He can manage one evening on his own. The question isn't whether he expects you. The question is, what do you want? I left the cafe with her question ringing in my ears. The world was suddenly full of questions I had never allowed myself to ask. I felt a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years, a flicker of the girl who used to dream of more than just a perfectly cooked pot roast. Later that evening, I messaged Carol back. What time is that pottery class? The journey within was leading me to old friends and new paths, and for the first time, I felt a genuine spark of excitement for what lay around the corner. The pottery class became my sanctuary. Every Thursday night, I would walk into the dusty, clay-scented studio at the community center and feel a sense of release. The instructor, a patient man with clay permanently embedded under his fingernails, showed us how to center a lump of clay on the wheel. It was, he explained, the most important step. If the clay wasn't perfectly centered, the whole piece would be wobbly and collapse. It felt like a metaphor for my entire life. I had never been centered. I had always been spinning off axis, pulled in every direction by the needs of others. My first few attempts were disastrous. The clay would fly off the wheel, splattering my apron and the wall behind me. Or it would slump into a sad, lopsided puddle. Carol would laugh with me, our hands and faces covered in gray sludge. For the first time in years, I was a beginner. I was learning something new, and it was humbling and exhilarating. There was no one to impress, no standard of perfection to meet. The simple, tactile act of working with the clay was grounding. It forced me to be present, to focus on the feeling of the earth in my hands. During this time, the situation at home remained tense. My quiet rebellion had sent ripples through the placid waters of our family life. John was bewildered by my new Thursday night routine. Pottery? He'd asked, the word sounding foreign and absurd in his mouth. What on earth for? Because I enjoy it, I had replied simply, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't argue, but he would be sullen and quiet on Thursday evenings, a silent protest against this disruption to his predictable world. The real battle, however, was with Beth. After 2 weeks of icy silence, she called. Her tone was not apologetic, it was wounded, accusatory. I don't understand what's gotten into you, Mom, she began. I called you 6 times yesterday. I was busy, Beth, I said, my heart starting to pound. I was in the garden, my hands in the soil. Busy? Doing what? The incredulity in her voice was sharp. I was busy with my own things. I didn't elaborate. Dr. Thorne had coached me on this. I didn't need to justify my time to my adult daughter. Then came the request, the one I had been dreading and expecting. Look, she said, her voice shifting from wounded to wheedling. I'm in a real bind. Jack's school has a half-day on Friday for teacher development, and his babysitter just cancelled. I have a huge presentation I can't possibly miss. I need you to take him. Just for the afternoon. This was the test. This was the moment where the rubber of my new self-awareness had to meet the road of my old obligations. The old Jean would have dropped everything in a heartbeat. Of course, darling. Don't you worry about a thing. The words were on the tip of my tongue, a conditioned reflex. But then I thought of Dr. Thorne. I thought of the feeling of the clay on the wheel. I thought of my half-finished drawing of a rose. I took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Beth, but I can't. I have plans on Friday. Silence. A thick, shocked silence. Plans? She finally sputtered. What plans? What could possibly be more important than your grandson? The emotional blackmail was so blatant, so textbook, that I almost had to admire its audacity. But for the first time, it didn't work. The guilt was there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was overshadowed by a new, steely resolve. "My plans are important to me," I said, my voice shaking slightly but firm. "You're a resourceful woman, Beth. I'm sure you can find a backup. You have 3 days to figure it out." "I can't believe this," she said, her voice rising in disbelief and anger. "After everything I do for you." "What is it you do for me, Beth?" I asked, the question genuine. I was truly curious to hear her answer. She was flustered. "What? I take you to doctor's appointments." "I haven't been to a doctor in 2 years, and the last time I went, I drove myself," I replied calmly. I organized Dad's birthday party." "Yes, you did. And I executed it," I said. "Beth, I love you, and I love Jack. But I am not your emergency backup plan anymore. My time is my own, and it is valuable. I am no longer available at a moment's notice to solve crises that you have the means and ability to solve yourself." She was speechless. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, a ragged, angry sound. Finally, she said, "Fine. I'll handle it. I don't even know who you are anymore." "I think I'm just starting to find that out myself," I said, and then I did something I had never done in my entire life. I ended the conversation. "I have to go now. Goodbye, Beth." I hung up the phone before she could reply. My hand was trembling so violently I had to set the phone down on the porch railing. My entire body felt like it was vibrating. I had said no. I had held the line. I had defended my small, shaky boundary against a full frontal assault. The fallout was immediate and visceral. I felt like a terrible mother, a selfish grandmother. The guilt was immense, but underneath it, there was a powerful, surging feeling of triumph. I had stood up for myself. I had chosen my own needs. It was messy. It was painful. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. But as I looked at my hands, covered in the rich, dark soil of my own garden, I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was the right thing to do. The wobbly pot was starting to find its center. The weeks following my no to Beth were a masterclass in passive aggression. There were no more direct confrontations, but the disapproval was palpable. Phone calls from Beth became infrequent and strictly transactional, concerning logistics for holiday get-togethers or a quick, emotionless happy birthday for John. Michael, my son, who had always remained on the periphery of our family dynamics, called me one evening. "Mom, Beth said you're going through something?" he asked, his voice laced with an uncomfortable caution, as if he were handling a delicate, explosive device. "I'm fine, Michael. I'm just making some time for myself," I explained. "Okay," he said slowly. "It's just that. Well, Beth is pretty upset. She feels like you've abandoned her." "Did she tell you that I've watched her children nearly every week for the past 10 years? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Did she mention the meals, the laundry, the errands? Or did she just mention the one time I said no?" He was silent for a moment. "Look, Mom, I don't want to get in the middle of this," he said, which was his lifelong refrain. "I just want everyone to be happy." "So do I, Michael," I said softly. "Including me." That conversation, more than anything, solidified my resolve. Their definition of happy was a return to the old status quo, where my needs were invisible. My journey was no longer just about rediscovering hobbies, it was about fundamentally restructuring the terms of my relationships. At pottery, I was slowly getting better. I had managed to create a small, slightly lopsided bowl. I was ridiculously proud of it. I brought it home and placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to the ticking clock. John looked at it, then at me. "You made that?" he asked. There was a note of genuine surprise in his voice. "I did," I said, smiling. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "It's lumpy," he observed. "Yes," I said, my smile not wavering. "It is. And I love it." He put it back, a look of quiet confusion on his face. He didn't understand the lumpy bowl. He didn't understand the pottery classes. He didn't understand the woman who was emerging before his eyes. But he was watching. For the first time, he seemed to be truly looking at me, not as a fixture of the house, but as a person capable of change. My friendship with Carol deepened. We started taking long walks on Saturday mornings, exploring local parks and trails. We talked about everything: books, politics, our fears about aging, our regrets. She told me about loves she had lost, and I told her about the quiet grief of a love that had simply faded into comfortable, passionless routine. Being with her was like breathing fresh air after being in a stuffy room for too long. She saw me. The real me, the one buried under decades of being a wife and mother. One afternoon, over coffee, I confessed my secret dream. I used to want to be an artist, I said, the words feeling shy and audacious at the same time. Carol didn't dismiss it. "It's never too late, Jean," she said simply. "What did you love to draw?" "Portraits," I whispered. I loved capturing people's faces, their expressions. The next week, Carol showed up at my door with a brand new, professional-grade sketchbook and a set of artist's pencils. "A gift," she said, brushing off my protests. From one artist to another. That gift unlocked something in me. I started to draw again, not just roses, but faces. I sketched the man who ran the corner store, with his kind, tired eyes. I drew a young mother and her child in the park. And then, I drew Carol, capturing the mischievous sparkle in her eyes as she laughed. The act of creating, of bringing something to life on a blank page, was a powerful act of self-definition. Each line I drew was a declaration: I am here. I am a creator. I have a perspective. I filled the sketchbook quickly. My lines became more confident, my shading more nuanced. I was finding my rhythm again, the muscle memory of my talent slowly reawakening. I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with serving others. It was a joy that emanated from within, pure and undiluted. It was the joy of a woman who was no longer just a reflection of the people around her, but was becoming a source of light in her own right. One evening, I was sitting on the porch, sketching, when John came out and sat on the swing next to me. He was quiet for a long time, watching my hand move across the page. "You're really good at that," he said finally, his voice soft. "I used to be better," I replied without looking up. "I remember," he said, and my hand stilled. I looked at him. There was a distant, sad look in his eyes. "I remember that drawing you did of the cat. In the old apartment. Before the kids." My breath caught in my throat. He remembered. That small, forgotten moment, a memory I thought was mine alone, had been living in his mind, too, all these years. "I'm sorry, Jean," he said, his gaze dropping to his hands. Well, for a lot of things. I guess I just got used to you being there. I stopped seeing you." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a solution to everything. But it was a start. It was an acknowledgement. It was a crack in the wall of his obliviousness. I didn't say, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. But I reached out and put my hand on his. "Thank you for saying that, John," I said. A small, lumpy bowl on the mantelpiece. A sketchbook full of faces. A Thursday night class. These were the tools I was using to rebuild my life. The journey was slow, painful, and often lonely, but it was mine. I was no longer just the silent keeper of other people's lives. I was the artist of my own, and I was finally, after all these years, beginning to like the picture that was emerging. The true test of my transformation came not in a moment of anger, but during a calm, calculated family discussion. It was late autumn, and the holidays were approaching. Beth, in a gesture I suspected was a strategic olive branch, had invited us all over for dinner: Michael, Sarah, John, and me. It was the first time we had all been together in her home since the infamous birthday party. Her house was immaculate, a testament to her professional success. But the atmosphere was strained, filled with the careful politeness of people navigating a minefield. After dinner, as we sat in her perfectly decorated living room, Beth cleared her throat. "So," she began, adopting her professional, boardroom tone. "Dad, Mom, Michael and I have been talking. We've been thinking about the future." I felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I looked at John, but he was looking at Beth, attentive and open. "We think it's time to start making some practical arrangements," she continued. "For you guys. You know, as you get older. We were talking to a financial advisor, and he suggested that it would be much simpler if you added my name and Michael's name to the deed of your house. And to your main bank accounts. It would just make things easier down the road, for probate and all that." "A simple legal matter," she smiled, a bright, reasonable smile. Michael nodded in solemn agreement. "Yeah, it just makes sense. Protects the assets for the family." There it was. The final frontier of my old life. My home. My money. The tangible results of a lifetime of my husband's work and my own careful management. They weren't asking, they were telling. They had consulted an advisor. They had decided. They were presenting their plan for my life, for my assets, as a foregone conclusion. The old Jean would have meekly agreed, flattered by their foresight, reassured by their desire to take care of things. She would have seen it as their right, as the natural order of things. But I was not the old Jean. I had spent months in Dr. Thorne's office untangling the belief that my worth was tied to my utility. I had spent hours with Carol, being seen as an individual. I had spent countless evenings covered in clay and charcoal, rediscovering the woman who had been buried for so long. I took a sip of my water, my hand steady. I looked from Beth's expectant face to Michael's earnest one. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the center of the room with the force of a physical blow. Beth's smile froze. "What?" "Mom, I don't think you understand. This is for your benefit. It's to make things easier for you." "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice even and calm. "You want me to sign over legal control of my home and my money to you and your brother. And the answer is no." "But why?" Michael asked, genuinely bewildered. "It's all going to be ours someday anyway. This just simplifies the process." The casual cruelty of his words, "It's all going to be ours someday anyway," was breathtaking. He didn't mean it to be cruel, I knew. To him, it was just a practical fact. But to me, it sounded like they were waiting for me to die. "Michael," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "Your father and I are still very much alive. This house is our home. The money in our bank account is our security. It is not a family asset to be managed by committee. It is not a future inheritance to be protected. It is ours, to live on, to use as we see fit. Perhaps I'll take up expensive hobbies. Perhaps I'll decide to travel the world. Perhaps I'll need it for long-term care so that I am not a burden to my children." I let that last sentence hang in the air. "As for down the road," I continued, "John and I have an appointment with our own lawyer next week. We will be updating our will and establishing a living trust that reflects our wishes. You will be taken care of, but you will not be in control. Not of our lives, and not of our finances. That is our decision, and it is final." A stunned silence fell over the room. Beth looked as if I had slapped her. Her face was pale with a mixture of shock and fury. Michael just looked confused, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. John, to his credit, sat up straighter. He looked at me, then at our children. He cleared his throat. "Your mother is right," he said, his voice firm. "It's our home. Our money. We'll decide what's to be done with it." It was the first time in our entire marriage he had presented a truly united front with me against our children. He had backed my play. He had seen the woman I was becoming, and he was choosing to stand with her. Beth stood up abruptly. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "After all we've done. We're just trying to help." "I know you believe that, Beth," I said sadly. "But helping and controlling are two very different things. For the first time in my life, I am in control of myself. I will not give that away. Not to you, not to anyone." The illusion of a happy family dinner was shattered. The minefield had been detonated. Beth retreated to the kitchen, and Michael soon made excuses to leave. The carefully constructed bridge had collapsed. But as John and I drove home in the darkness, I didn't feel sad. I felt powerful. I had drawn the ultimate boundary. I had protected not just my assets, but my autonomy. I had declared my independence in the most tangible, undeniable way possible. The journey inward had led to this moment of profound external strength. I was no longer a supporting character in their story. I was the author of my own, and I had just written a chapter that would change the ending for everyone. Months turned into a year. The changes in our family were not sudden or dramatic, but gradual, like the turning of a season. The raw, angry wound of that final confrontation slowly began to heal, leaving behind a scar that served as a permanent reminder of the boundaries that had been established. There were no more assumptions, no more casual demands. My time was respected because I had demanded that it be. My relationship with Beth was transformed. The old, easy codependence was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more deliberate, but ultimately, more honest. She stopped calling me for favors and started calling me, occasionally, just to talk. Our conversations were stilted at first. We tiptoed around our new reality. But one afternoon, she called and asked if she could come over. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once felt so invisible. She didn't have a crisis to solve or a request to make. She just had a cup of tea. "I went to see a therapist, Mom," she said quietly, staring into her cup. "After that night at my house. I was so angry. I told the therapist what you said, how selfish you were being. And my therapist looked at me and asked, 'What has your mother ever asked you for?' And I couldn't think of a single thing." Tears welled in her eyes, and in mine. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she whispered. "I just took and took. I never even saw you. I just saw, Mom, a function, a resource. I am so sorry." It was the apology I had never known I needed. It was a balm on a wound I had carried for decades. I reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry, too," I said. "I'm sorry I never taught you how to see me. I'm sorry I never valued myself enough to ask for what I needed." In that moment, we were not just mother and daughter. We were two women, flawed and struggling, finding our way back to each other on new, more equal footing. John and I found a new rhythm. He started coming with me on my Saturday morning walks with Carol. At first, he was quiet, just listening to us talk. Then, he started to chime in, telling stories from his own life that I had never heard. He took an interest in my art, buying me a proper easel for my birthday. He even cleaned out the garage to create a small, sunny corner for me to use as a studio. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, a cookbook open on the counter, attempting to make my pot roast recipe. It was a disaster, but we laughed harder than we had in years as we ate burnt on the outside, raw on the inside roast beef. His efforts were clumsy, but they were efforts. He was learning to see me, to participate in the life we shared, not just be a passive recipient of my care. I filled sketchbook after sketchbook. My lumpy bowls became more symmetrical, more confident. I joined a local art guild and even sold a small portrait at their annual show. The validation was wonderful, but the true joy came from the act of creation itself. It was a conversation I was having with myself, a way of processing the world and my place in it. I had found my voice, not just in words, but in charcoal lines and spinning clay. And so my life settled into its new shape. It wasn't a life free from problems or sadness. But it was a life that was authentically mine. I had let go of the crushing weight of other people's expectations, the invisible burden of always being there for everyone else. I had learned that my value was not determined by my usefulness to others, but by my own existence. I was worthy of love, respect, and time, simply because I was me. The last scene is a simple one, an ordinary morning. I stand at the front door of my home, a home that is truly mine, and watch the sun rise over the horizon. The light spills across the lawn, making the dew on my roses glitter like diamonds. The house is quiet behind me. John is still sleeping. My children are living their own lives, solving their own problems. My world is no longer a frantic, chaotic orbit around their needs. It is still, and it is centered. I walk back to the kitchen, make myself a single cup of tea, and sit at the table. The sun streams through the window, warming my face. My sketchbook is on the table, open to a blank page, full of possibility. The ticking clock on the mantelpiece no longer sounds like a judgment. It sounds like a promise, the steady, rhythmic beat of a life being lived on its own terms. A subtle smile plays on my lips as I gaze out the window at the world. For the first time, in a long, long time, I am enough. Exactly as I am.